Hey, welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in. We're going to get right to business this morning, this being the anniversary of September 11th. I wish I could dedicate my hour to another discussion about September 11th, but I don't know, maybe I'm cynical, but it appears, to me at least, if you don't know that 9/11 was an inside job, you're probably never going to accept it, even if the evidence is brought forward in conclusive proof. But the United States changed because of September 11th, 2001, and more than ever became the battle axe for the papacy to promote the Pope's New World Order. And we have more to mourn than 2 buildings or a half a dozen buildings and the loss of over 3,000 lives. We have a loss of a country. And a country once considered Protestant. And now it's controlled by Rome. And this book that we're reading proves it. Out of the mouth of a Roman Catholic, a devout Roman Catholic, one assigned as the ambassador of the United States to the Holy See, Francis Rooney. His book is entitled The Global Vatican. It's an inside look at the Catholic Church, world politics, and the extraordinary relationship between the United States and the Holy See. It's an admission and a boast that the Vatican controls foreign and domestic policy, not just for the United States, but for the whole world. But the role that the United States plays is critical for the advancement of the Pope's global empire. The man of sin, the son of perdition, the papacy. I know that's not what's taught in your Protestant churches, but your Protestant churches aren't Protestant anymore. They teach Roman Catholic theology. Roman Catholic theology has always taught Catholics that the Pope is not the Antichrist. It's someone else. It's either Nero or Caligula or some other, Alexander the Great, or it's somebody of the future, not the Pope, not the papacy. But historicists, those who read and understand their Bible and are not deceived by Rome's setting aside of the truth and the promotion of fables, understands by Scripture and by history that the papacy was, and always will be the Antichrist of the Bible. And today we're going to talk about just another one of the many Antichrists who have risen over control of the Roman Empire and the so-called Christian world, the Christendom they call it. Karl Wojtyła, better known to you probably as Pope John Paul II. And we're also going to talk about one of the most famous presidents of all time, President Ronald Reagan. Born and raised a Protestant, but had Catholic leanings, at least during the latter portion of his presidency. And now we'll begin where we left off yesterday. We concluded yesterday with the account of the election of Pope John Paul II, there being 3 popes elected in that same year. Pope Paul VI died and was replaced by Pope John Paul I, who was assassinated after 33 days, and then John Paul II. Now, if you're following along in your own copy of the book, we're in the first full paragraph on page 134. It says, Karl Wojtyła, and I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, Karl Wojtyła, former Archbishop of Krakow, was the first non-Italian pope elected by the College of Cardinals in nearly 5 centuries, and the first Polish pope. Where he came from was just the start of what made this man remarkable. At a time when many people were once again predicting the decline of the Catholic Church, John Paul II quickly established himself as one of the most important popes in history and one of the most significant world leaders in the 20th century. Now, don't forget, we're talking about the Antichrist of the Bible. He says that John Paul II was destined to be an important historical figure was immediately evident to those whose job it was to know such things. Analysts at the CIA issued a report on October 19, 1978. Remember, the Knights of Malta control the CIA, and it is a Catholic organization. And that's why I call it Catholics in Action. Catholics in Action. Not Christians in action, Catholics in action. And it was the CIA's business to know who was going to be Pope and what they might expect from his papacy. So we're talking about the CIA now. That John Paul II was destined to be an important historical figure was immediately evident to those whose job it was to know such things. Whose job was it? The CIA. Analysts at the CIA issued a report on October 19, 1978, just 3 days after Wojtyła's election, which turned out to be largely accurate. The report, entitled "The Impact of a Polish Pope on the USSR," unquote, calculated that John Paul II's election spelled trouble for the Soviets. Quote, "In the near term, there should be no crisis in the Soviet-Polish relations," unquote, the report stated. The long-term effect was a different story. Quote, "A Polish pope will reinvigorate the Catholic faith in these areas and may embolden Catholic dissidents to engage in more vigorous protest activities," unquote. The report concluded that, quote, "The Soviet leadership is probably already anxious about how to cope with the ultimate impact of a Polish papacy on East European nationalism, as well as such derivative issues as Euro-communism and Soviet dissidents," unquote. So clearly, the CIA, Catholics in Action, saw the potential of a Polish pope, one from Poland, who was under Soviet control, what that could pose for Russia. Now, never lose sight of the fact that communism was a creation of the Jesuits. And it was run by Jesuit-trained premiers. It served the papacy. And how did it serve the papacy? By providing the international dynamic that was necessary to advance the Pope's global New World Order. You see, the Church cannot advance its global government agenda unless there is conflict in the world. And through those conflicts, left, right, communists, fascists, or through these international conflicts, the papacy has an opportunity to advance its agenda. If the world is satisfied with the status quo and there's no conflict and everybody's at peace, the Vatican cannot advance its agenda. There has to be some energy. There has to be a call for change. Now, this idea that this Polish Pope is going to cause trouble for the Soviet Union should simply inform you that the Vatican needs a different dynamic to achieve a particular portion of its global aims. And it's got to appear, at least for a time, that the Russian threat of anti-Christian atheism, remember, communism was posed to the world as atheistic and a direct threat to quote-unquote Christianity, which means a direct threat to the Roman Catholic Church, and the papacy, it's all a theater, that this threat has to be removed. And it's going to take the help of the United States to do it. And through all of it, the papacy gains more power, more strength, more authority, and more following in the world. And remember, during this time, Vatican Council II was going. And the Protestants were coming back to the Roman Catholic Church. And it was all necessary for a global government by the Pope. Now, the report concluded that the Soviet leadership is probably already anxious about how to cope with the ultimate impact of a Polish papacy on Eastern European nationalism, as well as such derivative issues as Euro-communism and Soviet dissidence. The CIA was on the mark about a Soviet anxiety. Leaders in the Politburo began worrying about John Paul at once. The KGB, which had pegged Karl Wojtyła as an anti-communist as early as 1971, produced a conspiratorial analysis that framed his installation as a conspiracy to destabilize Poland. Should this destabilization proceed, Soviet leaders adduced it could lead to further destabilization in other parts of the empire, such as the Ukraine and Lithuania. Sound familiar? Okay. Destabilization in Ukraine and Lithuania, where Catholics made up a large portion of the population. Declaring the Pope, quote-unquote, our enemy, the Polish Communist Party concluded that, quote, all means are allowed and we cannot afford any sentiments, unquote. All right, the communist worries reached a head when the Pope began planning a visit home to Poland in 1979. Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev warned Polish Communist Party leader Edward Gierek to keep the Pope out of Poland, but Gierek was in a bind. Quote, how can I not receive a Polish Pope when the majority of my countrymen are Catholic, unquote, he asked Khrushchev. It says, quote, they view his election as a great achievement. Furthermore, how could I justify why we are closing the border to the Pope, unquote. Gierek was probably right when he had no choice but to allow the Pope to visit. Brezhnev was right to worry, okay? So the Pope's going to Poland. The communists, the Soviets are worried about it. At least that's what we're given to believe. It's all the strategy to maintain the momentum of the left-right momentum necessary to keep the advancement of the grandfather clock. Okay? The Godfather clock. The New World Order. He says even before he departed for this much-anticipated homecoming in Poland, John Paul II was establishing himself as a force of practical diplomacy to be reckoned with. Practical diplomacy. Diplomacy is the, makes the Pope look like a peacemaker, doesn't it? It says, in late 1978, for example, he offered to mediate a dispute between Argentina and Chile regarding territories in the Beagle Channel, a signal that he intended to engage the world actively in the tradition of popes like Leo XIII and Benedict XV. Indeed, he was continuing a tradition of papal activism and territorial dispute resolution that reached back even further to ratification of the well-known treaty the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which gave most of South America, except Brazil, to Spain. Now remember, that's the imaginary line. This man divides up the world, much as God divided up the land to the Israelites. This man thinks himself to be God on earth, and he drew an imaginary line down the Atlantic Ocean and divided the world in two parts, part to Portugal and part to Spain, and both were Roman Catholic nations. And if you've never heard of the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494, remember that was the time of Christopher Columbus, and the world was divided by the Pope. And the whole world yields to his decrees. All right? The Treaty of Tordesillas. Now, John Paul II would prove to be the most active pope in history, a man in near perpetual motion. Over the course of his 9,665 days as pope, the longest term in the papacy, with the exception of Pope Pius IX, he would visit 129 countries, 1,022 cities, and log more than 750,000 miles of travel, according to his biographer, George Weigel. None of his trips would be as important as that first 9-day return to Poland. Quote, 9 days, as Weigel states, during which the history of the 20th century turned in a fundamental way. Unquote. John Paul II landed in Warsaw on Saturday, June 2nd, 1979. In a brief speech at the airport, the Pope stated that his visit was, quote, dictated by strictly religious motives, unquote. In other words, not political. This coming from the most political institution on the planet, the papacy. John Paul II had the temerity to say that his trip to Poland was dictated by strictly religious motives to allay suspicion in the government that he was here to stir up trouble. He never directly criticized the communist regime during his visit, yet the mere fact of his presence, from the moment he knelt down and kissed the airport tarmac in Warsaw, which means in papal protocol that the Pope is claiming ownership, when he bends down and kisses the ground at the airport, you know your country does not belong to you, at least not from Rome's point of view. He said, yet the mere fact of his presence, from the moment he knelt down and kissed the airport tarmac in Warsaw, was freighted with political import. Okay? It was freighted with political import. The whole purpose of John Paul II's visit was to upset the Soviet Union and to advance his papal agenda. Now, simply exhorting his fellow Poles to renew their Catholic faith was an act charged with subversive implications. Quote, Christ cannot be kept out of history in any part of the globe, unquote, he told a crowd of Warsaw Victory Square at Warsaw Victory Square. Quote, the exclusion of Christ, the exclusion, the exclusion of Christ from the history of man is an act against man, unquote. Already the Polish people were bridling under communist rule, and now the Pope reminded them of their Polish and still very Roman Catholic identity beyond the crumbling facade of communism. So it had everything to do with politics, and religion was the cover. That is the very basic definition, the most elemental characteristic of the Roman Catholic Church. It is first and foremost a political institution that covers itself in a cloak of religion to give it credibility. And it has destroyed the reputation of Christ and of Christianity in the world. What more would you expect the Antichrist to do than to defame Christ and give him a negative reputation in the world? Most people's perception around the world of Christianity is in the context of the horrors that have come out of what is generally accepted in the world as Christianity. It's not Christianity at all. It's Roman Catholicism. And much of the bad reputation that the Roman Catholic Church has given Christ has been blamed on America, which they call Protestant. Rome does her dirty deeds in the world, as we just got done talking about the Vietnam War, but it was America that led the assault, and Protestantism gets the blame. Okay, whenever it's appropriate, whenever it's necessary, whenever it's expedient, Rome admits that America is Protestant. So all of the negativity, all of the wars, all the manipulation, all of the foreign policy, all the State Department nonsense, all the CIA nonsense, all the wars are blamed on Protestantism. The great error of Christianity. The Protestant Reformation is defamed, not the Pope. Christianity, Christ and Christianity is defamed, not the Pope. I hope you understand this. Now, he made some very flowery quotes. The exclusion of Christ from the history of man is an act against man. Already the Polish people were bridling under communist rule, and now the Pope reminded them of their Polish and still very Catholic identity beyond the crumbling facade of communism. Wherever John Paul II went in Poland, from urban cathedrals to rural shrines or the grisly ruins of Auschwitz, he spoke to enormous crowds. They sang and cheered and wept. As much as a third of the entire population of Poland saw him in person over the course of his 9-day visit. Imagine that. A third of the population of Poland crowded around to see him. When he flew back to Rome on 9th of June, he left behind a country energized for change. He set the Holy See on a new course, beyond Ostpolitik and into an active engagement against repression. Oh, it's against repression. Okay? Yes, that Pope. Where would we be without the Pope, right? Are you repressed? Well, you can expect the Pope to relieve your repression, can't you? So thinks this author. Now, he says, not long after, the new energy in Poland was channeled into political action. Ta-da! It was not about politics, though it resulted in political action. And we're supposed to be dumb enough not to see through it. He says, when the Polish government raised food prices in late summer of 1980, a 36-year-old electrician in the Polish city of Gdansk, Lech Walesa, helped organize a strike which led to the formation of a movement called Solidarity. This was the first non-governmental union in all of communist Eastern Europe, and it owed its birth in large part to the Pope. Quote, the Holy Father told us, don't be afraid, change the face of the earth, be strong believers, unquote, Lech Walesa later recalled. Quote, then all of a sudden people thought about his words and woke up, unquote. Kind of makes you wonder, when will it ever be that the Protestants will wake up? He says, just over a year after the Pope's visit, the power of solidarity was already so great that the Polish government had little choice but to authorize an agreement recognizing the trade union's legality. Lech Walesa signed his name to the agreement with a souvenir pen from the Pope's 1979 visit. If there isn't a lot of significance in that, I don't know what there is. Lech Walesa signed that agreement with a souvenir pen that the Pope gave him in 1979. It was the Vatican's intent to at least publicly appear to be overthrowing the Soviet Union. A Jesuit creation. We'll be back right after this.
Years ahead of the dominant media. First Amendment Radio.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you'd like to support Inquisition Update, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. And if you'd like to contact me, please do so by email. My email address is tom@seawaves.us. And I enjoy listening to the comments and suggestions of my listeners, and I answer questions whenever appropriate. And many of the books that I've read here on Inquisition Update have been recommended by some of my listeners. And if you have an important Protestant book, we don't read Moby Dick here. This is not about entertainment. Suggest it, and I'll read it, preview it, and we'll see. If you have criticisms, by all means, feel free. These are controversial subjects. And having been so thoroughly indoctrinated with futurism, I'm sure there are many questions. And I'll answer them as patiently and carefully as possible. Now, we're talking about a period of time when the papacy and the United States together are making it appear that the Soviet threat has been defeated. Why is that? I mean, after all, they benefited so much from the threat of nuclear annihilation, global nuclear annihilation, in the advancement of this global New World Order. Well, never forget that Russia's still there. Russia still has the potential to be what it ever was, a threat to Christianity. But the Vatican and the United States were ready to move the world into terror over other threats affecting us all. The threat of global Islamofascism, the rise and spread of Islam, the conquering of the world by Islam. The world's attention, the attention of the military, had to be directed to a very prized possession in the Middle East. Because the Pope's ready to conduct his phony futurist re-fulfillment. Jesus caused the sacrifices and oblations to cease 2,000 years ago. But the Pope rejects that. He's got to put up a phony counterfeit to that event. And Jerusalem is the apple of the papacy's eye. And Islamofascism poses a threat to the papacy. So the world's attention has to be placed on the Middle East. And terror is the instrument through which this attention is gained for the ultimate achievement of control of Israel, control particularly of Jerusalem. The stage is being set, and there are a few props left on the stage from the previous scene that have to be removed before we can set it up for the next scene of the play. And Ronald Wilson Reagan is going to help. So is Bibi Netanyahu and the other presidents of Israel and the other nations of the world. And in addition to the Muslim threat, this idea that the Muslims are procreating at a rate multiples faster than the Christian world, who abort their babies, the world stands within 50 years of being overrun by Muslims, and the government's overthrown by Muslims, and caliphates to replace them. Sharia law. Never mind the terror of Roman Catholic canon law. No, Sharia law, it's the worst of the worst, they say. And so this threat has to be removed. It's just simply the new threat. In addition to all that, we have the environmental threat. There's too many people in the world. God was a fool. He said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But now that we've discovered that we fallible men and antichrists, have discovered that God put us on an earth that's not capable of sustaining us. Not enough water, not enough air, not enough trees, not enough electricity. And the world is in a global crisis. And that has resulted into an economic crisis. People starving all over the world. And it has resulted in war and war and more war. We need a global government because of it. Well, isn't that just ducky for the Pope? We need a global government. That's the conclusion coming to all the world. We need a single man that understands the world's problems so thoroughly and can solve those problems. We need to give up our national sovereignties. We need to literally undo what God did at the Tower of Babel. God separated men according to their languages, put them in different parts of the world, and now they're all in conflict. They're all under the same threat of annihilation, either nuclear or Islamofascism or environmental or economic or overpopulation or lack of resources, on and on and on. We've got to have somebody that can fix this. Somebody that we can see on our television and listen to on the news. Someone to give mankind new hope. And of course, I didn't even mention the UFOs and the little spacemen, the what do they call them? The Nordics, or the, what do they call them? The reptilians, yeah. We're in big trouble, boy. You remember Ronald Reagan even kowtowed to that cockamamie nonsense when he stood before the UN and said, wouldn't it bring us all together if all of a sudden all the nations of the world were threatened by a common threat? Invasion from outer space? And the world buys the lies. I mean, you can't make up stuff like this. You know what this boils down to? Satan knows he has very little time left. And he's got to pull out every deception he can possibly bring out. Every threat. Everybody's cowering under the table because of all these imminent threats that could just destroy the whole world. Nuclear, I've named them all. Nuclear annihilation, starvation, economic it's just, I wish God would rapture us out here, all the Christians are saying. I'm sorry, it isn't going to happen. Now, this deception is going to run its full course. Satan is going to be given an opportunity to rule this world and to exalt his throne above the stars of God, to sit upon the mount of the congregation in the side of the north, to be like the Most High. And most of the world, most of the Christian world, believe it or not, are going to worship him. And this is all just part, what we're reading here is just all part of resetting the world stage to advance this global government. All right, as solidarity was taking root in Poland, Ronald Reagan entered the White House to become the 40th president of the United States. The Cold War was now in its 35th year. The Soviet Union and its satellite communist dictatorships were an accepted, albeit detested, fact among the Washington foreign policy community. Containment, articulated by George Kennan in 1946 and implemented by Secretary of State Dean Acheson in 1949, had been the policy of every president since Truman. Now Ronald Reagan came along and asked a question, a simple question that some people found impertinent. Why should America contain Soviet communism? Why not abolish it? Quote, my theory of the Cold War, Reagan told his future National Security Advisor Richard Allen, is that we win and they lose. Allen later paraphrased Reagan's position as follows. The United States, this is a quote, the United States would no longer be content merely to shape and influence Soviet behavior, but would set out to change the Soviet system itself, and literally, quote-unquote, roll back Soviet advances and conquests outside its borders. The objective was to find weak points in the Soviet structure, to aggravate the weaknesses, and to undermine the system. This represented a sea change in U.S. policy. A sea change in U.S. policy. Unquote. Now, this is how the papacy controls the foreign policy of the United States. Now, Robert Gates, who served as Deputy Director of Intelligence at CIA in the early 1980s, writes that, quote, Reagan, nearly alone, truly believed in 1981 that the Soviet system was vulnerable, not in some vague, long-range historical sense, but right then, unquote. After the years of détente and mutually assured destruction, and a raft of other jargon, Reagan's view was disarmingly straightforward, but his method was a sophisticated application of several levers of coercion at once. The most obvious and controversial of these was increased defense spending. To his critics, Reagan seemed a warmonger, wantonly adding new military systems to an already overloaded nuclear stock. Richard Allen insists that Reagan was, quote, in fact, fundamentally a disarmer, unquote. He believed the way to end the Cold War was to take the upper hand, to go on offense and put the Soviets on defense, and show them how their own expensive military buildup was futile. Henry Kissinger, an outside observer of the Reagan White House, agrees with Allen's assessment that Reagan, far from welcoming war with the Soviets, feared it, feared it intensely, and yet was convinced that confrontation was the best strategy, in the long run, to make the Politburo stand down. As Kissinger writes, quote, Reagan believed that relations with the Soviet Union would improve if he could make it share his fear of nuclear Armageddon, unquote. Now, don't you know all of this is always couched in terms of Armageddon, a biblical concept. This is all to appeal to Christians, quote unquote. Adding to the Soviets' woes, the Reagan administration also deployed a number of economic tools, including embargoes. Now remember, in Roman Catholic canon law, it's no sin to deprive a heretic of his wealth. It's called economic sanctions. It was always practiced in the Roman Catholic Church when a Protestant, opposed the papacy or opposed the king of the nation under which he lived, who was crowned and controlled by the papacy, why they were regarded as heretics and their property was confiscated, or they were denied the basic necessities of life. People were forbidden to feed them, to water them, to give them succor and comfort, and if the opportunity arose without necessary risk to themselves, they could kill a heretic and thereby gain grace from the church. So economic sanctions is not a national idea. It's a papal idea. It said, adding to Soviets' woes, the Reagan administration also deployed a number of economic tools, including embargoes, to challenge their already feeble economy. Yet Reagan, like Truman, knew that military and economic tools were only part of the equation. Ultimately, this was a fight for the souls of humans, for there was no better way to defeat communism than to give hope of a better life and those living under communist rule. A better life to those living under communist rule. Remember, under the communist rule, which is supposedly atheistic, if they're given hope of salvation in the Roman Catholic Church, I mean, because in the Roman Catholic Church, there's no salvation outside the Roman Catholic Church. So if the atheist people of Russia are given first learnings that salvation and eternal life is available, and it's only available through the Roman Catholic Church, why, they might just rise up and overthrow communism. That's the business of the CIA, the Catholics in Action, which is paid for by your tax dollars. And, of course, unlimited drug profiteering. Now, he says, and there was no greater messenger for delivering this hope than Pope John Paul II, the Antichrist of the Bible, one of the many. In the spring of 1981, the President and the Pope shared something else in common. Each narrowly survived an assassination attempt. Reagan's near-death encounter came on March 30th, 1981, when John Hinckley shot him in front of the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. Now remember, John Hinckley is a relative, a very close relative, I believe a brother, of a very, very close friend of Vice President at the time, George H.W. Bush, who worked as well for the Vatican. And I believe it was an attempt for George H.W. Bush, who was the top dog at the Catholics in Action, simply wanted to be president. And they found this, mentally challenged John Hinckley to do the deed. Nonetheless, the author says Reagan's near-death encounter came on March 30th, 1981, when John Hinckley shot him in front of the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. Reagan recovered fully and emerged from the shooting more spiritually alive. All of a sudden, he'd seen Mary, right? Now, specifically, his brush with death seems to have awoken a latent interest in Catholicism. Let me tell you something. If you're Protestant, as Ronald Reagan professed to be, there is no latent interest in Roman Catholicism. So Ronald Reagan was never Protestant. If he wasn't Protestant, what was he? He was just a professing Christian, if not a card-carrying Roman Catholic. As a matter of fact, Reagan finally came clean before he died. He made several trips to Ireland where his family is from, and they're all Roman Catholic. He came in touch with his Roman Catholic roots, they said. Oh, what demons masquerade as Christians in this world? He says, though raised a Protestant, Reagan, whose father was Roman Catholic, already displayed an affinity for Catholics. He surrounded himself with a notable number of Catholics in his administration, almost total Catholics. I mean, everybody in the White House wore a crucifix, man. He's supposed to be Protestant. He doesn't even know the definition of Protestant, and he foisted that lie upon the American people because they don't know what Protestantism means either. And it's very simple. You protest the Antichrist. You live for Jesus Christ and you stand up for him against the evildoer. That's what Protestantism is. Ronald Reagan didn't stand up against the evildoer. He didn't stand up for Christ. He stood up for the Pope at your expense. That's the truth. This so-called Protestant surrounded himself in the White House with notable numbers of Catholics in his administration, including William Casey at the CIA, devout Roman Catholic, Knight of Malta. Okay? Alexander Haig at the State Department, Richard Allen as National Security Advisor, Vernon Walters as his roving ambassador. Even his speechwriter was a devout Roman Catholic, Peggy Noonan. And nobody cares. No Protestant protests. When in your life during the Reagan administration, if you were alive during his presidency, when did you ever were informed by the press or your Protestant pastor that Ronald Reagan's entire White House cabinet is Roman Catholic? Nobody ever said a word to me about it. It's a secret. Don't want to wake up the Protestants. Keep that quiet. It was a Catholic administration, top down. It was a Catholic administration. He's teaming up with the Pope to destroy the Soviet Union. What theater! It captivated the imagination of the entire ignorant world. He says shortly after returning to the White House from the hospital, he invited Cardinal Terence Cook of New York to visit. Quote, I have decided that whatever time I have left is for him, capital H, he told the Cardinal. What he wanted the president to do, Reagan believed, was to bring communism to its knees. What he, capital H, wanted President Reagan to do was to bring communism to its knees. Are y'all sitting on the edge of your seats? You all believe this stuff? Oh, the whole world believes it. Don't feel bad if you believed it. I even believed it, okay? Not anymore. God opened my eyes. He said 6 weeks after Reagan's scrape with death, John Paul II had an even closer call. On May 13th, 1981, the Pope was shot several times from nearly point-blank range in St. Peter's Square. Right there in the middle of St. Peter's Square, in the middle of the church, among throngs of people. Unlike the attempt on Reagan's life, which was the work of a disturbed individual, no mention at all that he was very, very close to George H.W. Bush, conveniently. He says, unlike the attempt on Reagan's life, which was the work of a disturbed individual, the assassination attempt on John Paul II gave every indication of conspiracy and spawning a mystery that remains unsolved to this day, says the author. The question at the center of the mystery was and still is whether the shooter, Mehmet Ali Agca, acted on behalf of the Soviet Union either directly or indirectly. Okay? How do you get the world to, really step up this phony war against the Soviets? Well, all you got to do is make it look like somebody from the Soviet Union tried to do in the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and every Christian will be right on his heels, baby. It worked. It says the circumstantial evidence for Soviet involvement in the Pope's shooting is intriguing but inconclusive. The leading theory is that Akka was hired as a hitman by the Bulgarian Secret Service, which operated under the orders of, or at least as a proxy for, the Soviet government. The first person to advance this theory publicly was author Claire Sterling in a Reader's Digest article in 1982. Other authors, including Paul Hens, John Kohler, and Nigel West, have written similar accounts. Gordon Thomas, in his book about the Israeli intelligence service Mossad, proposes that Ayatollah Khomeini was behind the attempt, but this theory is an outlier. Okay? Remember, we're going to pass the bag to the Muslims. We're moving the crusade from communism to Islam. And he says that this article was an outlier. In other words, it was, kind of held in reserve over here in the drawer. Okay? Akka himself has given so many conflicting statements over the years as to render his testimony useless. But his travel itinerary and standard of living in the months before he shot the Pope suggests that he was being financed and supported by someone with deep pockets. He also had frequent contact with Bulgarians, including a 50-day visit to Sofia shortly before he went to Rome. If the Bulgarians were behind the assassination attempt, Soviet complicity was a given. The Bulgarians were unlikely to carry out such an operation without Soviet sponsorship. The Soviets were not lacking in motives to offer this, for the Pope had brought them nothing but grief since his visit to Poland in 1979. So, the great threat to Christianity has made an attempt on the Pope's life. They're going to step up the terror. And thanks to Ronald Reagan, the battle axe for the Pope, the world got what it was expecting. And the show must go on, because the New World Order cannot be achieved without this kind of theater. We'll be back next week for more from this wonderful book, very informative, The Global Vatican. We'll see you Monday.
.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening. Gold and silver is tremendously undervalued. Global demand vastly exceeds mine supply by more than 60% annually. There is little in the financial world more certain than a coming explosion in the prices of gold and silver. The U.S. dollar continues to lose value and respect as the world's reserve currency. Our nation faces challenges on many fronts, and a day doesn't pass without another economist bringing forth warnings of impending economic calamity. There has never been a better time than right now to acquire physical gold and silver. Discount Gold and Silver Trading was founded on the principles of truth and honesty. We believe in providing a quality product, quality service, and most importantly, competitive pricing. We provide all forms of precious metals, including American gold, silver, platinum, and rare investment and circulated coins. Silver bars, rounds, and 90% silver bags are on hand for the silver investor. Gold self-directed IRAs are available. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, that's 1-800-375-4188.